Hey everybody, it's great to be here at the DesignOps Conference. Hope you're all enjoying the event, and let's get into my talk. Today we're going to talk about a problem that design systems face. But before we get to that, let me actually introduce myself. Who am I and why am I doing this talk? Well, I'm Berk. I'm one of the co-founders of Zeplin. Zeplin is a design delivery workspace where teams can publish, organize, and share their designs. At Zeplin, I started out as a developer. I was basically working with our designers, building our apps. Eventually, as the team was growing, I transitioned over to product. As you know, Zeplin's needs evolved over time. That's what I needed to do, and this really actually helped me have different perspectives on the challenges that both our team and our users were facing. Zeplin's been around for a while now. It's been about 7 years, and I've been constantly thinking about different problems that designers, developers, PMs face day to day. I've been lucky enough to work closely with our users, all sorts of teams, from freelancers to super large enterprises, and learned about their challenges. And today, we're going to talk about one of those challenges. That's about design systems, particularly why design systems are still disconnected. This is about the disconnect between multiple sources of truth that make up our design systems. I feel like this problem is the elephant in the room that not a lot of people are talking about, so let's shine some light on it. Before we dive in, though, we should take a step back and talk about how design systems evolved recently. This will give us more context about how the problem came to be. And I'm sure you've heard about this a million times, but design systems have been around for a long time. But in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been talked about a lot. At this point, I'm sure all of you listening have some sort of design system, or you're just jealous that all of your friends have one and you're still working on yours. Well, how did design systems get so popular recently? Let's take a look at what happened in the last 10 years from a designer's perspective. So we're going to take a trip down memory lane to year 2010. This is the time I got my first job as a developer. This is the time when Blackberries were still around. And this is the time Photoshop was the primary tool that UI designers were using. And considering design systems, Photoshop didn't really have any features that helped with reusability. Basically, you're kind of encouraged to copy and paste things as you're creating new designs. And this obviously slows you down, if you want to go back and change a component you already built. But more importantly, the tool gives you complete freedom to tweak your components as you please. There's nothing stopping you from making small adjustments here and there as you're copying and pasting things. And that's where I feel like things, start to become tricky. Around the same time, Adobe actually had another tool called Fireworks. It was less popular compared to Photoshop, but still pretty commonly used among UI designers. I'm sure there are some people out there listening that have used Fireworks. It was pretty cool. And it had one key feature that I believe shaped the future of UI design, and that's symbols. Yeah, symbols back in 2010. You were able to reuse your UI elements, just like components in Figma or symbols in Sketch today. And like this wasn't enough, after doing some research, I realized that it had more features. Look at this. This is symbol properties, and you were able to define properties for your symbols, basically like overrides we have in Sketch. Or here's states, a more primitive version of component variants in Figma. It's kind of wild that we consider these features advanced today, and Fireworks took the first steps almost 12 years ago. Well, unfortunately, Fireworks story has a sad ending. It got discontinued in 2012. Adobe thought there was a lot of overlap with tools like Photoshop and Illustrator, so they basically got rid of it, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because about 3 or 4 years later, they introduced a new tool called Adobe XD, which focuses on very similar use cases. Anyhow, fast forward 2 years, 2014, and this is where Sketch comes in. Actually, Sketch has been around before 2014, but this is when they released their version 3. And it was all about reusability because it introduced the idea of symbols. Today we all know what symbols are, but you now also know where the name comes from. Around this time, a lot of people were moving from Photoshop, Fireworks to Sketch. This is the time that sort of a big migration started. But symbols weren't adopted too quickly. Because this was a completely new way of working, and it was disruptive for a lot of designers' workflows. Based on the export data we have at Zeplin, in the early years, there were a lot of designers who just simply didn't want to use symbols. And when you compare that to today, it's pretty funny because almost everybody uses symbols or components today. Initially, when this feature came out, designers were thinking, hey, how can this help me work faster? They were more concerned about solving their own problems. And as the feature evolved, then they were questioning, like, hey, maybe this feature thing can help us, work across the design team, sharing symbols across multiple designers. And, today it was kind of a stepping stone to design systems. So this is a great example of how tools influence the way we work. All of these tools that we talked about really played a critical role in bringing the idea of reusability to the forefront for designers. Now, we're going to take a look at the same time frame, but from a developer's perspective. Reusability is nothing new to a developer. It's been around since the beginning. Still, something interesting happened around the same time that Sketch was out, and it made more and more developers make use of this concept of reusability. And that's React and all these amazing component-based libraries. These new libraries helped us think web UIs in a component-driven way. What does that mean? It basically means that these tools, they promote reusability. They encourage you to divide your UI up into multiple reusable pieces. So as these libraries and the component-driven workflows start to become more and more popular, more and more developers were thinking about how to reuse day to day. So we see a very similar picture here. The tools we use evolve and become best practices, and that's why the way we think about reusability, the way we prioritize reusability evolved. So yes, design systems and reusability have been around for a long time, but the tools we used in the last 10 years played a huge role in why they are so popular now. One thing I want to highlight here, though, is that both designers and developers, we started to reuse things in our own bubble. What do I mean by that? On one side, designers were like, hey, I'm reusing symbols in my design file. That's great. And then developers are like, oh, I'm reusing components in my code base. So what's sort of the obvious next step? Why don't we reuse together? This question basically marks the birth of what we now call design systems. And it's about the shared understanding between designers and developers. We sort of got to get together and start reusing things together instead of doing it separately. But it's not all rainbows and butterflies, and there's a fundamental problem here, and it's related to how we got here, and it's related to the tools we use. Let's take a look at a visual representation of a design system. On the left, we have the design files with components, which are obviously built and maintained by designers. On the right, we have components from our code base, and those are built and maintained by developers. Most importantly, designers and developers collaborate, because that's what turns this thing into a design system. But what's missing here? Right, the link, the connection between the design file and the code, or the lack of the connection. They represent the exact same thing, but there is no connection between them. This is the problem that we're going to focus on. The idea of, having a primary button in your design file and a primary button in your code base, but you can't really keep them in sync unless you're doing it manually. In fact, we can make things a little bit more complicated because there are more steps. We need a place to document these components. Documentation for each component consists of usually like a visual representation of the component, which might be taken from the design or maybe the actual running code. You need to have some guidance around how to use the components, some do's and don'ts. And based on the teams I talk to, this documentation is mainly maintained by designers, but obviously developers are involved as well. This thing is either a custom website or you would use tools like Zero Height or DSM. The issue is now we have 3 sources of truth that represent the exact same stuff. Your documentation, might be connected to your design file. It also might have some sort of connection to your code base. Maybe you're embedding your storybook stories in there, or you simply have a code snippet in there. But all of this stuff is maintained manually, completely manually. And another question is, what is the source of truth in the setup? When I talk to developers, they kind of claim that the code base is the source of truth, because that's what's running in production. That's what our users are interacting with. Makes sense, right? But when I talk to designers, they claim that the documentation is the source of truth. In the end, that's, where all of the decisions are documented. But yeah, I guess the most important thing here is that there's nothing keeping these things in sync. This is very fragile. So there has to be a better way, right? Well, right now, not really. There are a lot of tools and solutions out there, including Zeplin, that try to solve different parts of this problem, different parts of the sort of chart that we're looking at. But there's no sort of one definitive solution, since you can imagine that's a very tricky problem to solve. Let's now imagine together, what would an ideal future look like? So with this current setup, here is, a typical workflow of adding or changing a component. The first step is to have alignment on what's needed. That's pretty typical. You involve your designers, developers, or anyone else in the process, and the decision's made. Then the designer goes in and they design the component on the design file, which is the left side. Then the developer builds the component. That's the right side. They're basically looking at the designs that the designers created, and then they're turning it into code. And then the third step, which is optional, but if you have some sort of documentation, designers would go in and update the documentation. And that's the thing on top. And that's it. Now, at this point in time, everything is in sync. All 3 sources of truth are in sync. But if you change any of these in the future, the other 2 will be out of date. Now, let's imagine this future where we have a separate design system entity, and it's shared across all of these sources. That would be the source of truth. We don't really know what that is, so I'm just going to put a unicorn in there for now. Now, notice here is that tools are not directly communicating with each other. They are kind of talking to the unicorn, and unicorn is the thing that keeps everything in sync. With this setup, if we think about the same use case of how do I add a new component? Well, the first step is the same. We get together, we have alignment on what we need. Then the designer goes in, they do the design in the design file, which is the left side. Now, this design is automatically reflected in the developer's code base because what you're doing in the design file is now stored in the unicorn and it moves from the design file to the unicorn to the code base. So the developer is not really starting from scratch. They already have some sort of foundation based on what the designer built, and they're building on top of that. Obviously, the design tool itself can't really define everything that's needed to have a running component. So the developer fills those gaps. They implement the necessary logic. If we look at the documentation tool above, the component is automatically added there too through the unicorn, and all we need to do is go in there and write the actual documentation itself. Now, there are still things we need to do on each side of this equation, but everything is kept in sync, and this is the ideal state we want to be in, because with this state, if a designer tweaks the padding of a component, it would immediately be reflected in the code base and the documentation. Obviously, if you want to have more control over this, you can put a review process in place. So all of these changes would initially be proposed, kind of almost like pull requests. Then they get reviewed and they get published. One thing I want to call out here is, even though this sounds great, one thing that sort of makes this great is that there's still separation between responsibilities of the people and the tools. So, for example, the designer is still working in the design tool that they're familiar with, and developers are still working with the tools they're familiar with. They're just building on top of the work that the designer already built, then get converted into code. Alternatively, you could try to approach this differently and make the design tool more advanced or have more technical capabilities. So the design tool is almost more like a development tool now. A good example of this is like Figma's auto layout feature, which is a great feature, but there is a fine line. Things might get too complex and restrictive for a designer pretty quickly, which I've seen in some cases where designers like struggling to figure out the right layout. So I think having this separation is helpful for both sides. So, right, we discussed many things in here, and as you can see, there are a lot of unknowns. But I believe over time, as our practices and our tooling improve, this is where we're heading. At this point, I can kind of hear you saying, sure, this is great, but what do we do in the meantime? Even if it's going to take us a while to get to an ideal solution, let's actually look at what we can start doing today to relieve some of the pain. All right. When I was showing you this diagram with the unicorn that's keeping everything in sync, I'm sure some of you were wondering, wait, is this design tokens? Are design tokens the solution we're looking for? Well, yes and no. For those who don't know, design tokens are standards that tools can rely on to share pieces of a design system. They usually include things like colors, typography, spacing, and all of these things are defined in a standardized format that all of these different tools or people can understand. So design tokens are what the future we talked about would be built upon, most likely. The solution, though, is about connecting the tools. Tokens are just the data that's shared. So ideally, when you're working on components 5 years, 10 years from now, everything will be in sync between the tools that we're using. And you're not even thinking about design tokens. It just works. So today, though, until we get to this perfect solution, if ever, design tokens are a great starting point. They're not going to solve all the problems we talked about, but they're going to be super helpful. How do you set up design tokens? Well, today it's not super straightforward to set up design tokens at your company, but it's easy enough to get started. So here's our diagram again. Designs on the left, code on the right. Ideally, your tokens should be stored outside of these tools. So the tools should be referring to the tokens. Today, this is a little challenging because our tools are not really built to support this. So, if you want to use tokens in your design file, you're going to have to use a plugin or so on. So it's kind of tricky. So a common workaround to this is to use the design tool as your tokens. So this way, you don't really need to maintain your tokens separately. Your color styles, text styles, they would be your tokens. So at this point, you just need a way to fetch that data and convert those tokens into code. This is pretty easy to do for colors and text styles because they're simple enough to translate to code, but currently it would be very difficult to turn a component into a token, like a button. That's not really a common practice as of yet. So I would recommend starting off with colors, typography, and possibly icons as well. I've seen icons work well in a lot of use cases. So how do I translate the tokens into code? That's also a very common question. To translate the design data to code, there are a lot of tools out there that can help you, but you can also build it yourself. Most design tools have some sort of API or access to the data that's, the underlying data of the design. So you can build some sort of script that looks at that data and converts it into whatever code you prefer. With this use case, you have full control over the workflow. And one thing I can recommend also is that at Zeplin, we do support design tokens. Zeplin basically stores your colors, text styles, which are pulled in directly from your design files. You can also define additional tokens in Zeplin as well, stuff like spacing. Then you would either download these tokens as JSON files, which is a super simple solution, or if you prefer to automate things, you can use Zeplin's API and webhooks, and this will keep your tokens up to date as they change in the design file. Right. So design tokens are great for things like colors, text styles, spacing. How about components? I mentioned that they don't really work well for components. What do we do? What do we do about components in the meantime? Even though what I'm going to suggest now is a pretty manual solution, there's something we really need to do before we even start thinking about automating this thing, and that's to maintain an explicit connection between components in design and components in code. If there is a primary button in your design file and there's a primary button, the same primary button in your code base, you have to make sure that both are referencing each other. Today, you can do this in a few different ways. One option is to maintain that connection in the documentation layer. Here, we're looking at Segment's design system, specifically the button component. And you notice that there's some documentation here explaining how the button should be used, and there are some visual references to the component, what it looks like, and most importantly, the sample code. This sample code tells me how to instantiate one of these buttons in code, the most critical thing being the name of the component in the code base. Also, there's an open in GitHub button on the top right, and this way, a developer looking at this immediately knows where this component lives in the code base. This is great. But obviously the problem is this documentation, these code snippets, everything needs to be maintained manually. This is a problem that we've been thinking about at Zeplin. Like, how can we make this a little bit easier? So we approached it a bit differently. So let me show you how really quickly. We know that a lot of developers use Storybook. That's where they build and maintain their components. So in Zeplin, we were thinking, why can't you just add a link to your Storybook instance? And then we would simplify and try to automate some of that difficult task of mapping the components in design and components in code. So Zeplin, with this UI, provides suggestions based on your naming conventions, so you can easily connect those two things together. And once they're connected, whenever you're viewing a component in Zeplin or you're viewing a component in Storybook, you have access to the other tool, so you can quickly jump between the two to basically get all the information you need. This is another way of keeping explicit connection between the components in design and components in code. So this about wraps up my talk for today. We talked about how design systems evolved over the last 10 years, how that was really driven by our tools, and unfortunately that our tools are still disconnected from each other. While some of these issues won't be fixed overnight, I believe that we'll be in a much more ideal state in the next 5 to 10 years as our practices and our tools evolve. Until we get there, though, I hope you can start applying some of the practices I just shared to ease some of the pain. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, any thoughts, here's my Twitter handle. You can reach out to me there. And have a wonderful day, everybody. Bye.